Welcome to A Listen at a Time, where we will be learning something, a listen at a time.
You sometimes hear these pronouncements lately, the kind suggesting, well, one person or one country is basically running the whole show globally. And maybe your first reaction, wow, that's a bit much,
Yeah.
right? But then, if you actually look back at history, you start seeing this long pattern,
Yeah.
a pattern of one particular nation, really shaping things on the world stage. It makes you wonder if maybe those blunt statements aren't just acknowledging something that's been going on for ages, just more openly.
That's really the heart of what we want to dig into today. We're not just reacting to the latest soundbite.
Right.
Instead, we're trying to trace that history, that arc of how one very powerful nation has approached global influence, looking past the official reasons, the stated intentions, to see the actual methods they used, and importantly, the consequences, what
Yeah.
actually happened on the ground.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack that. So the nation we're focusing on, obviously, is the United States.
Hmm.
And we've got quite a bit of history to sift through here. It shows a pretty compelling story, sometimes kind of surprising, about how the U.S. has projected its power internationally for decades now.
Exactly.
And like you said, it's not always about tanks and soldiers. We're talking about the subtler ways, the stuff that's often less visible, that a nation can use to, well, mold the world to fit its interests.
Absolutely. And a huge turning point. You really have to start after World War II.
Okay.
Think about it. Europe, Asia, just devastated. But the U.S., its industry was intact. Its economy was booming, relatively speaking. This just catapulted it into this, well, unprecedented position of global leadership.
Right.
Then you have the Bretton Woods Agreement. That basically pegged other currencies to the U.S. dollar, which was convertible to gold.
But dollar becomes king, essentially.
Pretty much. It made the dollar the currency for international trade. And yeah, maybe it helped stabilize things, but it also put the U.S. dollar right at the center of global finance. That gave the U.S. enormous leverage, just immense.
So right off the bat, a massive economic tool in their pocket. And then you add in setting up these big international bodies, the UN, the IMF, World Bank, NATO. It almost sounds like they were building the scaffolding for American influence, even if the stated goal was stability and cooperation.
That's a good way to put it. These institutions, yeah, they were meant to stop the kind of nationalism and instability that led to the wars, but their structure, how they were set up, it kind of embedded U.S. influence right into the system.
How so?
Well, the U.S. had a huge amount of say within these organizations, voting power, funding, and the whole system just naturally helped global trade and finance flow in ways that, well, often benefited the dominant American economy.
Okay.
This whole period, really, it kicks off what people call the Pax Americana.
Right, the American peace.
Yeah, basically a time after World War II where the U.S. is the top dog, influencing the world order, maybe keeping some kind of peace, but definitely through his own power.
But it wasn't just about setting up the rule book for everyone else. The history we're looking at also shows the U.S. used, let's say, less obvious methods, sometimes much more covert methods to get what it wanted.
Oh, absolutely. Now we move away from the overt stuff, the military actions everyone sees, into the world of covert intervention.
Okay.
The National Security Act of 1947 is really key here. It set up the CIA, the National Security Council. Now, the act didn't explicitly say, go run secret ops.
Right.
But later directives like NSC-4A and especially NSC-102, they laid the groundwork, the sort of bureaucratic justification for the CIA to do just that, covert actions, often things like propaganda, political maneuvering.
The goal was always that the U.S. government could sponsor it, but deny it publicly, right? That plausible deniability.
Yeah.
Exactly. Plausible deniability. The idea was the president, the government, could make things happen secretly, but could honestly, or perhaps dishonestly, say we weren't involved.
And this whole system sort of evolved over time, with different committees trying to oversee it, Special Group 303 Committee, 40 Committee.
Yeah, attempts were made to manage this hidden side of foreign policy, trying to keep control while still maintaining that deniability for the president.
It sounds like a really tricky balancing act.
Yeah.
Potentially very risky.
It absolutely was, and the history gives us some really stark examples of these covert operations in action. Each one had its own reasons, stated and unstated, and usually big long-term consequences.
Right.
Let's take Iran in 1953, Operation Ajax.
Right. Overthrowing Prime Minister Mossadegh, the official line was fear of communism, wasn't it?
That was the justification, yeah. But the information strongly suggests that Mossadegh nationalizing Iranian oil, which hit the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, what later became BP, really hard, was a huge factor, maybe the main factor.
So oil and politics mixed together.
Definitely. The CIA and Britain's MI6, they worked together. Propaganda, bribery, even staging riots to make the country seem unstable, to undermine Mossadegh.
And they put the Shah back in charge.
They did, which at the time looked like a win for the West, but this is where you see that idea of blowback so clearly.
The unintended consequences.
Exactly. The Shah ruled as an authoritarian, backed by the U.S., and that resentment just built and built until it exploded in the 1979 Islamic Revolution, which, created decades of hostility.
Wow. So a short-term fix leads to this massive long-term problem. A key lesson there maybe about unforeseen results.
Absolutely. These things aren't isolated. They ripple outwards for decades, and often they end up hurting the very interests they were supposed to protect.
Okay, so Iran 53, then just a year later, Guatemala 1954. Similar story in some ways.
Very similar pattern. Again, the fear of communism is waved around. But you also had the United Fruit Company.
Ah, the original Banana Republic influence.
Pretty much. They owned vast amounts of land, had huge influence in Guatemala, and the democratically elected president, Arbenz, he started land reforms.
Which threatened United Fruit's bottom line.
Exactly. So the U.S.-backed opposition forces supported a military coup. Arbenz was out. And what followed? Decades of instability, military dictatorships, terrible violence.
So again, economic interests mingling with Cold War ideology leading to intervention. It seems like a recurring theme where corporate interests really help shape foreign policy.
It's a pattern you see again and again, especially in that era. U.S. economic interests, powerful corporations, having a direct line to foreign policy decisions, often pushing for intervention.
Let's jump to the 1960s, the Congo. What happened there?
Well, after independence, you had Patrice Lumumba as prime minister. The U.S. got very nervous about him. He seemed too neutral in the Cold War, accepted some Soviet aid during a crisis.
Even though he was more of a nationalist than a communist?
Yeah, most evidence points that way. But the fear of communist influence was enough. The CIA was actually authorized to remove him. There was even an assassination plot considered, though it wasn't directly carried out by them in the end.
But the intent was there.
The intent was there, and the U.S. then supported Mobutu's coup. Mobutu took power and ruled for decades as a dictator, notoriously corrupt, while the Congo's incredible mineral wealth was exploited.
And Lumumba?
Lumumba was eventually captured and murdered, likely with Belgian support, and there are still serious questions about potential U.S. complicity or awareness. It's a very dark chapter.
Okay, so Congo,
Yeah.
then Chile in the early 70s. This
Yeah.
involved Salvador Allende, right?
Yes, Allende, a democratically elected Marxist president. His election set off huge alarms in Washington, especially when he started nationalizing industries, including U.S. copper companies and ITT's film company in Chile.
Okay, Seden's economic interests again, front and center.
Very much so. And here, the U.S. used a kind of two-track approach. Track one was all about destabilization, economic pressure, funneling money to opposition groups, funding critical media outlets like El Mercurio, encouraging strikes. ITT itself was heavily involved in pushing for intervention.
And track two.
Track two is more direct, actively exploring support for a military coup to prevent Allende from even taking office, or to remove him later.
Did the U.S. directly cause the 1973 coup?
It's complex. They didn't necessarily press the button on the day, but did they create the conditions? Did they undermine Allende's government relentlessly? Did they signal support for a military takeover? The evidence strongly suggests yes. And the result was Allende's death and the rise of Pinochet's brutal dictatorship.
These examples, Iran, Guatemala, Congo, Chile, they paint a pretty consistent picture, don't they? A willingness to intervene, often secretly, to protect what were seen as strategic or economic interests, even if it meant undermining democracy.
And often with terrible human costs and long-term instability for the countries involved. It wasn't just about changing leaders either.
What else?
Oh, well, think about the Vietnam War. You had the Phoenix program.
Ah, yes. That sounds ominous.
It was conceived by the CIA, but mostly carried out by the military. The goal was to, quote, neutralize the Viet Cong's political infrastructure. That meant capturing, turning, or assassinating suspected VC cadres, often done by these provincial reconnaissance units, or PRUs.
Neutralize sounds like a euphemism.
It often was. The program became incredibly controversial. Lots of accusations of targeting civilians, torture, assassination quotas. It was a very brutal part of the war.
And there's one more major example from that era, Indonesia, mid-60s.
Yes, Indonesia, 1965-66. The U.S. was very worried about President Sukarno. He was leaning away from the West. And the Indonesian Communist Party, the PKI, was very large and influential.
So Cold War fears again.
Big time. Then there was an alleged coup attempt in '65. The army under General Suharto responded with a massive purge. The U.S. covertly supported Suharto and the army. There's evidence the CIA even provided lists of suspected PKI members to the Indonesian army.
Lists for what?
Lists for elimination. What followed was a horrific wave of mass killings. Estimates range from 500,000 to maybe 1 million people killed. Communists, alleged sympathizers, ethnic Chinese, just slaughtered.
My God. And the U.S. was complicit.
The evidence points to U.S. awareness and support for Suharto's forces during this period, seeing it as a way to eliminate the PKI and shift Indonesia firmly into the Western camp. Suharto took power, establishing his authoritarian new order, which lasted decades. Strategically, for the U.S. in the Cold War, a win. But the human cost and the U.S. role in it, it's staggering.
It really is sobering, seeing this pattern across continents, across decades. And beyond these covert regime changes or neutralization programs, there are other tools too, right? Less dramatic, maybe?
Sure. We should briefly touch on economic coercion, things like sanctions, financial pressure. We're not diving deep into that today, but it's definitely another tool in the influence toolbox.
Right.
And then there's propaganda, psychological warfare, information operations. During the Cold War, this was huge, using media outlets like Voice of America, Radio Free Europe.
Getting the American message out.
Getting a message out, sometimes openly attributed that's white propaganda. Sometimes the source is hidden gray propaganda, and sometimes it's put out under a false source, maybe attributed to an enemy that's black propaganda. Planting stories, funding publications, cultural exchanges, all designed to shape perceptions overseas.
And this wasn't exactly new even back then, was it? You mentioned the Banana Republic idea earlier.
Right, that goes back to the early 20th century. You had powerful U.S. corporations like United Fruit deeply involved in Central American countries like Honduras, Guatemala. Their interests often drove U.S. policy, leading to economic dependence, political instability, and, U.S. interventions when those interests felt threatened.
So that link between corporate power and U.S. foreign policy, it has deep roots.
Very deep. It shows how economic motives have often been intertwined with geopolitical ones, sometimes indistinguishable.
Now, obviously, these actions, especially the covert ones, weren't usually presented to the American public or the world as, we're doing this for oil or we're doing this for United Fruit. There were justifications.
Always. Anti-communism was the big one during the Cold War, obviously. A very powerful lens through which almost any action could be justified.
Anything to stop the Soviets.
Pretty much. And tied into that is the broader idea of American exceptionalism. This belief that the U.S. is unique, maybe morally superior, with a special mission to lead the world, promote democracy, or its version of it.
Right, the shining city on a hill idea.
Exactly. That kind of thinking, that sort of savior mentality, it helped justify interventions, both to the people carrying them out and to the public back home. It squared potentially self-interested actions with this positive image of America's role in the world.
Though maybe that justification wears thin over time, especially when people look at the actual results.
I think that's fair to say. Especially now, in a world that's maybe more skeptical, certainly more multipolar, the effectiveness of that argument is definitely being questioned more.
Which brings us back to consequences. We touched on blowback for the U.S., like Iran 79. But for the countries targeted, what were the typical outcomes?
Often devastating, as we've seen. Political chaos, the rise of dictators who might be friendly to the U.S. but brutal to their own people, widespread human rights abuses, economies distorted to serve foreign interests, a deep loss of sovereignty, just lasting instability.
And the blowback for the U.S. itself wasn't just Iran, right? It created broader resentment.
Absolutely. It fueled anti-American sentiment across Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, Asia. It created new enemies, sometimes directly leading to threats against U.S. interests or security down the line. It demonstrates how interconnected everything is, how actions can have these unpredictable negative loops.
So the Cold War ends. The primary justification, anti-communism, kind of disappears. Did the intervention stop?
Not entirely. The methods may be adapted, the justification shifted, humanitarian intervention, war on terror, but the underlying tendency for the U.S. to intervene in other countries' affairs seems to have persisted, though now, of course, the global landscape is different.
Right, a more multipolar world, other big players, China, Russia, challenges to U.S. influence.
Exactly, which makes this whole history even more relevant, I think. Understanding how the U.S. wielded its power when it was largely unrivaled helps us understand the dynamics now when its power is being contested.
And it really highlights that gap we mentioned earlier between the stated goals, democracy, freedom, stability, and often the actual motivations, and crucially, the outcomes.
That gap between rhetoric and reality is pretty consistent throughout this history. It raises fundamental questions about how global power actually works, doesn't it?
It certainly does. So looking back over this whole deep dive, this historical arc, it's hard to avoid seeing this consistent pattern.
Mm.
A very powerful nation using all sorts of means, overt and covert, economic and military, to shape the world. And the results, as we've seen, are just incredibly complex, often damaging, and frequently unintended, even for the U.S. itself.
And thinking about that history, it really forces you, the listener, to consider how you interpret what's happening now. When you see powerful nations acting on the global stage today, what are the real motivations? What might the long-term consequences be this time? Are we seeing echoes of these past interventions?
It definitely gives you a different lens for looking at current events. Loads to think about there.
Hmm.
Now, looking ahead, we're actually planning another deep dive that touches on these themes in a maybe unexpected way.
Oh.
Yeah, we're going to explore how these ideas about global power, dominant forces, resistance, how they might show up in popular culture, in storytelling. Imagine, for example, a hugely popular animated film, something seen worldwide. How might it depict powerful entities and those challenging them?
Ah, interesting. Like Nezha 2, perhaps, and how it portrays certain dynamics?
Exactly. Without giving too much away, it makes you think about where these narratives come from and how they might reflect or even shape our understanding of real-world power. It's fascinating how these things seep into culture.
It really is. How these big geopolitical dynamics get translated into stories we all consume. That should be a great discussion.
Definitely something to look forward to. But for now, we really hope this historical look has been useful. We encourage you, as always, keep exploring these complex topics, keep digging into the history, and always try to consider different perspectives on how global power works.